Every few years, we see new and exciting genres and subgenres emerge into the mainstream of the gaming world and take over the zeitgeist. Back in 2016, we saw the emergence of hero shooters with Blizzard's critical and commercial darling Overwatch. More recently and currently, however, we've also seen the rise of the Battle Royale. Originating from mods of popular games such as DayZ and Arma, we've seen the subgenre develop from independent releases such as PUBG and H1Z1 to more mainstream takeover with Fortnite, Apex Legends, and even Call of Duty joining the conversation with Warzone. Last year, we may have finally started to see a new subgenre enter the mainstream conversation, the roguelike. For those that don't know what exactly a roguelike is, the general idea involves trying to get to the end of a particular game in one run. Usually death results in you, the player, having to start the game at the very beginning. Depending on the game, you'll see variations in the formula such as permanent upgrades to help subsequent runs, a certain level of randomization in the levels of the game during each run, as well as different weapons and power-ups that can help lead to build and general gameplay diversity each time you play. In 2020, we saw Hades release out of early access to widespread critical and consumer acclaim. The game could be found near the top or at the top of many of the year's publications. Now as we arrive at the 9th generation of consoles with the PS5, Series X, and Nintendo Switch, we may start seeing a lot more of these kinds of releases. With the release of Returnal and Deathloop later this year, we get to see a major publisher like Sony take a stab at the genre and get an understanding of how the roguelike may evolve under the view of more mainstream attention. While Returnal is a PS5 exclusive, it's actually a second-party exclusive developed by Finnish studio Housemarque. Housemarque has been around since 1993. Originally, they were known actually as Bloodhouse before renaming themselves to Terramarque in 94 and then once again to Housemarque in 95. They've been primarily known for creating arcade-style twin-stick bullet hell shooters. Their original title in 1993 was Stardust, and since then, they've released 23 games in their company's history. However, a relationship with the PlayStation has always been a common thread throughout their DNA. Arguably, their most popular games have been PlayStation exclusives. Those games have included Super Stardust HD, Dead Nation, Resogun, which was actually a PS4 launch title, and a few others. So it's no surprise to see Sony and Housemarque teaming up once again to create a PS5 launch title with Returnal. The stakes are a little bit higher this time though. This is Housemarque's first foray into the AAA space. It's another story in PlayStation's long history of building up smaller developers to AAA status. And using that strategy, they've been doing really well throughout the second half of the PS3 era and the entirety of the PS4 era. That, along with Returnal being the first exclusive outside of the PS5's launch window, as well as a controversial $70 price tag, brings with it an extra amount of pressure and expectation for Housemarque. So, how is the game? Well, let's dive into it so I can give you my breakdown and personal thoughts of Returnal. Let's start off with the basic premise of the game. In Returnal, you play as Asterisk Corporation's space explorer Celine. At the start of the game, Celine goes through a near-fatal crash that lands her on the mysterious planet of Atropos. As you soon find out, Atropos is a shape-shifting planet that has Celine stuck in a Groundhog Day time loop. Whenever you die, you find yourself back at the starting crash site with the planet once again terraforming to present new environments and new challenges. Through your multiple runs of Atropos, you'll find clues to a precursor civilization as well as audio logs left by past iterations of Celine to give you clues on what might be going on. Without going into spoilers, the key word of that last sentence really is might. In terms of narrative hook, I was invested to see Returnal through to the end to figure out why the time loop is occurring, what was the story of the precursor civilization, as well as what Celine's backstory is, and why exactly she's seeing visions and hallucinations of her Earth-based home on this planet. However, after beating the game 3 times, as well as seeing all of the endings, I'm still walking away from the story extremely puzzled. There are many confusing, ambiguous, and contradictory story beats that occur throughout the unfolding nature of the story that constantly left me scratching my head. It's clear that Housemarque wanted to leave much of the game's plot ambiguous and open to interpretation. I have no problem with storytellers not spoon-feeding plot points, but I feel like Housemarque went maybe a little too far here. Many theories of the plot that I was devising based on early hints in the narrative feel just like that by the end of the game. Theories, rather than concrete interpretations of the events that unfolded. Even with the stereotypical Returnal explained Google search post-completion, it's clear that there isn't a clear follow-through for what is transpiring in the game's narrative. When the entirety of a story's narrative is almost completely ambiguous and up to interpretation, it can feel a little obnoxious and infuriating in retrospect. I think a big reason for this is managing expectations. I'm a huge fan of From Software's Soulsborne games. In those, the story can be pretty vague and obtuse when you're playing through it, but it's pretty clear that that's the case from the start. There's a really deep and interesting lore in those games, but but you have to go out and search for it and piece together the clues. In Returnal, the story is ambiguous, but it takes front and center attention multiple times throughout the run of the game. There's many times where you'll enter Celine's old house for story segments where the gameplay is put completely on pause for story exposition. It constantly feels like Returnal is building up to a climactic reveal that will explain at least some of its mysteries, but it never definitively answers anything. I really wanted to like the narrative more. I really dig when stories in any narrative make you question what exactly is going on and get a little trippy. However, I feel like Housemarque miscalibrated a little here, creating a really interesting mystery, but not following through on that intrigue in a meaningful way, and ultimately leaving too much in the air for questioning. With Returnal being a PS5 exclusive, it really is a great showcase for the console's technical abilities. The game runs at dynamic 4K at 60 FPS with ray tracing on. With many games coming out now asking players to choose between 60 FPS or ray tracing at 30 FPS, I've always been defaulting to the 60 FPS option, as personally, I enjoy the increased responsiveness of 60 FPS over the visual enhancements that come with ray tracing. However, here you don't have to choose, which is really nice. Overall, on a technical side, I never experienced any issues with Returnal. The game seemed to hold at 60 FPS pretty consistently, and if there were any drops, I was never able to notice them. The game is also pretty polished in the bugs category. Besides some enemies getting stuck in geometry, I never experienced anything that hindered my immersion or gameplay. It is worth noting that I've seen other outlets and reviewers state that the game did crash on them a few times, which can be a serious issue with a roguelike game where a reboot involves a start from the very beginning, but personally, I never experienced any issues of the sort. We also really get to see the benefits of the PS5's SSD and display here. There's basically no loading in the game. Once you're in the game, you're in it with no downtime. That speed also translates to the general speed of Celine. It's obvious with how fast you're able to move through the environments and levels that this level of fluidity and speed just wouldn't be possible in the previous generation of consoles. Returnal is also another showcase for why the DualSense is the best controller out there right now. The haptic feedback is honestly amazing. You can feel drops of rain, loot being picked up, and guns being fired in very different and subtle physical feedbacks throughout the controller. Each gun you fire has a different level of tension and feedback, and the L2 button can be used as essentially two different buttons by holding it halfway or all the way down for regular aiming or using your secondary fire respectively. Artistically speaking, Returnal also delivers. While the game might not be a graphical powerhouse showcase like you might find in a Rockstar or Naughty Dog game, it still looks really good. The environmental design on display really makes you feel like you're in the ruins of an old alien civilization on an alien world. You'll find yourself traversing through swamps, deserts, frozen wastes, forgotten cities, and more. There's a lot of variety on display here with the multiple biomes. A lot of the visuals clearly draw inspiration from the likes of Alien, Prometheus, as well as other video game franchises such as Metroid. The visuals of the enemies are also very well done, with their creepy, Lovecraftian, tentacle-like design. While you'll probably be too busy surviving hordes of enemies to stare at the scenery, when you do get the chance, Returnal is a visually creepy delight to behold that also feels great to play due to the PS5's technical capability. Finally, we can get to the main attraction of this game, the gameplay. I'm going to just start off with this before we get into anything. This game is so much fun to play. It really is a melting pot of a bunch of different game franchises put together, and I really enjoyed that. Probably because those franchises it pulls from, I really enjoy. It's like Doom meets Control, meets Metroid, meets Hades, meets PT. That's a lot. So let me explain why I'm mentioning those franchises in reference to this game. In terms of moment-to-moment combat, that's where Doom and Control come in. It really feels like if you took Control's movement and combat and pasted it into the levels of Doom or Doom Eternal, you would get Returnal. The movement and gunplay feel so similar to Control, you would think that this game was made by Remedy. I will say, I think the movement and gunplay is tighter here than in Control. Just like Doom, you're always on the move if you want to stay alive. Seriously. If you're trying to play this game anything other than a third-person Doom, you're going to get your shit rocked. Movement and aggressive gameplay is constantly incentivized. When you dodge, you gain a moment of invincibility, and combining that with clearing out a room of enemies will increase your adrenaline. Adrenaline in this game is essentially a bar that starts out at 0 and goes till 5. It increases every time you kill an enemy, and at every whole number, you get some sort of stat increase that makes you better. However, if you get hit once, your adrenaline will shoot back down to 0. Understanding how to maneuver around the environments and avoid enemy attacks is arguably more important than taking those enemies out. And once you figure that out, you're bound to do better in your runs. However, the guns themselves are all really satisfying and fun to use, even if that doesn't always translate to viability. While there are only about 10 weapons, every gun you come across has completely randomized stats. That means you can come across the same gun you're already using, but it may have completely different fire rate, ammunition, and alternative fire abilities. Personally, my favorites were the assault rifle, the shotgun, and the electro pylon driver. More on that later. I felt like many of the guns that had slower moving bullets than those guns weren't the most viable, as sometimes you would have to lead your shots to hit targets since the enemies in this game can move really fast. In terms of its Metroid influence, the in-game map is pulled straight out of Metroid Prime. As you progress through multiple biomes and defeat bosses, you'll also get permanent upgrades that let you access previously unreachable areas in the previous biomes, a la Metroid. Those upgrades can involve grappling hooks to reach new locations, a sword that can break through shield barriers, and more. What's also nice about some of these upgrades is that they can also be used in the heat of combat. A lot of times, you can use the grappling hook to get out of some sticky situations where you might be cornered and need a quick escape to the other side of the room. With the sword, you can also use it as a melee weapon that deals serious damage. The PT influences are pretty obvious here. Every time you enter Celine's old house, the game switches to a first-person perspective as you slowly explore the mysteries of the decrepit home. All of those examples and comparisons are good for helping to understand the moment-to-moment gameplay, but I think the comparison to Hades, and honestly the roguelike genre in general, is the most important because it gives an understanding of the game's structure, its design, as well as some of its mechanics. There's a lot of things that this game does differently compared to Hades and other roguelikes, so let me explain. Some noteworthy takes on the roguelike formula involve the use of items. Every time you die, you always start the run in Returnal with your original starting pistol. That forces you to really adapt your runs and playstyles to the guns and abilities you have in that particular run, instead of getting comfortable. I personally thought this was a nice spin on things, but it also comes with the downside of not being able to particularly build Celine towards a specific gameplay build during any run. That can also lead into some of the items you come across that aren't weapons. You'll come across items called parasites, which essentially give you a stat buff, but also a stat nerf. That same pro-con dynamic is visible with malignancies. Sometimes you'll come across health or upgrade items that may have a chance of being malignant. You'll then have to decide if you want to take that item, but risk equipping a malignancy that will create a negative gameplay effect for you. Besides those two, there are also items called artifacts that are always some sort of positive enhancement, no strings attached. While this may all sound interesting on paper, the reality is that the majority of the time, it isn't worth taking the negatives that may be inflicted on you. I almost always found myself avoiding malignancies and parasites, knowing that if I was patient, I could come across an artifact that would help me out pro bono. One negative I also have to get out of the way is the camera. Most of the time, it isn't a problem, but it's not the best at helping you understand your surroundings. There's so many times where I would be trying to avoid enemy fire and just walk myself into a corner and then get wrecked by enemies. Or even worse, when I would dash right off of a cliff and lose a quarter of my health from a lethal fall. Seriously, whoever decided to make like 40% of the rooms have gaps that you can fall and lose a big chunk of your health from, who hurt you? Like, especially in a roguelike, an accidental fall off a cliff when you already have super little health can result in a wipe that's going to make you lose a ton of progress. I only ever died from a situation like that once, but man, did I get pissed off a few times when there were rooms that I fell into endless pits multiple times. I said at the beginning of the video that a key facet of roguelikes is that when you die, you start from the very beginning. That's actually not entirely true, and that's where this game comes in. The reality is that Returnal is a roguelike split into two sections or acts. The first act is biomes 1 through 3. The second act is biomes 4 through 6. What this means is that if you die anywhere in the first act, you get set back to the beginning of biome 1. If you die anywhere in the second act, you get set back to the beginning of biome 4. On top of that, there are interesting implications to future runs depending on how far you progress. Whenever you're able to beat a boss in any given run, you actually don't have to fight that boss again in future runs. On top of that, the game also provides a handful of shortcuts within each act. For example, there are shortcuts in Act 1 that can take you straight to the boss of the second biome, or even let you skip the second biome entirely and go straight to the third biome. I think all these changes to the formula are honestly needed because a successful run in this game can go on for a lot longer than something like Hades, which usually has its runs around 30 to 45 minutes. Just like other roguelikes, there are also items that can extend your runs past one life. There's an item that lets you essentially come back to life right where you died, and there's also a machine you can find that lets you use Ether, a currency that stays with you between runs, to spawn after death in the middle of a biome instead of the start of the act. I think it's important that I lay this all out because I think this is a good time to talk about the conversations around difficulty with the game and my experiences with that. Now, I'm about to say something that's probably going to go against everything you've heard about this game from other reviewers and outlets. I did not think this game was hard. For reference, I beat the entirety of this game's first act, biomes 1 through 3, in one attempt. From there, it only took me 4 attempts to beat Act 2, or biomes 4 through 6, and see the end credits. There's a few reasons for that. In my run of the first act, I got an artifact that made it so every time I defeated an enemy, while I had adrenaline, I would get health back, and that effect would only increase with the more adrenaline I had. As I realized that movement was arguably the most important aspect of the game, keeping adrenaline was easy for me, essentially keeping my health high for the majority of biomes 2 and 3. In the second act, I didn't have that upgrade, but instead I found out that one of the weapons, the electron pylon driver, is totally OP. This thing shoots electric rods at enemies, and not only can those rods connect with each other to create a huge electric orgy, they also continue to keep doing damage over time. In most cases, it would just take 1 or 2 clips from the pylon driver, and then the continuous damage of the electric rods would just delete any enemy. This ties really well into my point from earlier about how constant movement is the key to success in this game. Well, when you have a gun that fights your battles for you, you can just dedicate your entire energy to just moving around and avoiding the enemy. It really takes away from the constant decision making of micromanaging when you should be constantly moving or deciding to fire on the enemy in the heat of battle. And when you're in a roguelike where death can result in a bunch of lost progress, why would I or someone else not use a weapon like that? Even when I did die on a boss, I always either had a second life or the chance to start back in the middle of the biome with a certain mid-level device. I really don't think this game is hard, but it is demanding. If you're not dialed into the combat, understanding enemy attack patterns, and knowing how to use your movement, then yes, you'll get your ass kicked. But I think if you can stay attentive during the heat of battle and do all the things I just mentioned, this game really isn't too steep of a challenge, along with all the shortcuts and item fallbacks the game provides. At the end of the day, there's really 2 ways to approach Returnal, as an action game or as a roguelike. Personally, I think the game is a great action game, but misses the mark on being a great roguelike. I think a lot of the decisions with weapons and item use lend themselves better to the moment-to-moment decision making that comes with the combat, better than they do with the idea of build diversity and experimentation that a game like Hades does so well. I also think the design choices for splitting the game into multiple acts, the lack of necessity to repeat bosses, and the implementation of shortcuts puts the game more in line with the Soulsborne than a proper roguelike to me. While some people might find all of this to be disappointing, I think your mileage really does come down to expectations coming in. If you're coming in expecting an action shooter that borrows elements from roguelikes, you're going to really enjoy the gameplay here. I personally found the moment-to-moment gameplay in Returnal to be more enjoyable than Hades, as I felt like Hades just became a little too button-mashy. But if you're coming in expecting a true-to-form roguelike such as Hades, you may walk away feeling disappointed. While I did come in expecting the latter, I realized the game was really the former pretty early on. Personally, that helped me adjust my perception, and in turn, I really enjoyed playing this game in spite of its missteps with the roguelike formula. I think the final point I want to touch on before I give my final rating is the value of this game, as well as the relation of that idea to the $70 price tag. It's been a really hot button issue, and honestly, I think it's been kind of overblown. To roll credits the first time, it took me 9.5 hours. To get the final ending of the game, which is technically Act 3, my playtime went up to 14.5 hours. Considering I only died a handful of times throughout, I would be confident saying that runtime is probably on the lower end. I've seen a lot of other outlets say it took them from 20 to 40 hours just to roll the credits the first time. Comparing that sort of playtime to some of the games this game is being compared to, that's definitely in the same range on the lower end and honestly higher on the average. So if you're someone who likes to gauge value on playtime, honestly, don't worry. For me, it comes down to quality over quantity, and I think this game definitely is quality. It's more of a question then, at the end of the day, if where the game excels is what interests you. At the end of the day, Returnal definitely has its pros and its cons. Sadly, the initial intrigue of the story doesn't go anywhere meaningful. However, the moment-to-moment decision-making, as well as the speed and freneticness of the combat makes it a delight to play. While the mechanics and design of the game don't necessarily translate to a great roguelike, they do still add interesting wrinkles to the gameplay itself. It's also a great technical showcase for the PS5 with its visual beauty, fast loading, and superb use of the DualSense. Returnal is a great melting pot that, while it doesn't outperform any of its individual inspirations, is ultimately greater than the sum of its parts. Final score, 8 out of 10. Well, everyone, thanks for watching or listening, whatever platform you're, experiencing this on. A little bit different than what we usually do. Usually, do off the cuff, just discussions, but this was a little more scripted, edited, put a little bit more put together. Let us know if you guys like this. I would love to keep doing more videos like this, so I'd love to just see the feedback on it. Thank you guys for listening, and thank you for supporting us like always. That's Ursel signing out. We'll see you guys next time.